So apparently, there's been a ceasefire or truce call between Hamas and between Israel. This is supposed to go into effect tomorrow at 2 a.m. Don't ask me why. You need X number of hours for the truce to go into effect. I suppose this has to do with various military operations. I'm not sure. Um, in under normal circumstances, if this was a war, oftentimes the people would use the time frame between in order to try to take more territory or take more land in order to so wherever they're standing at the point where the truce goes into effect, well, that's basically what they hold on to at the end of any kind of negotiations that are going to take place after. But this is not really that. This is basically, okay, the truce is going to go into effect 2 a.m. Tomorrow. Um, Supposedly, Netanyahu security cabinet basically is saying that they are agreeing with an Egyptian proposal for a mutual ceasefire without any preconditions. Now, without any preconditions. Now, that part is interesting. Hamas originally said that in order for a ceasefire, they would need guarantees about Al-Aqsa, meaning the military is not going to invade Israel. It's not going to, or Israelis aren't going to invade the military. It's not going to invade Al-Aqsa. And also this notion of Sheikh Jahar not expropriating that land and stealing that territory, stealing that land from the people who live there in East Jerusalem. So if they're saying no preconditions, apparently those preconditions weren't necessarily met. What's interesting here is whether or not Hamas considers this a win. And for that matter, what did Israel get out of it? Well, from Hamas's standpoint, I think the positives are straightforward. You have nobody talking about the West Bank. Nobody's talking about Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas. Nobody's talking about him at all. Everybody's basically talking about Hamas. You had a situation where the world community saw Hamas as being the thing that was standing in opposition against Israel and in opposition and not just that, galvanizing the Palestinians across the board, not just across the board, Arabs, even in Lebanon and in the various countries in Jordan, to come together under this notion of banner of Palestine. And they were able to bring and connect those people with the struggle that was taking place in regards to the expropriation of land in East Jerusalem. They were able to do that. This was somewhat of a political win, if you want to call it that. By the same token, there's also great loss. It was costly, to put it mildly. You had 230, give or take, people to be killed. Half of those were women and children. A third of those were kids. I think it was like over 60 kids that were killed. And on top of this, you're talking about infrastructure that was already dilapidated, that have been devastated, that much more. Electricity that was already dilapidated, that much more. Hospitals destroyed. Routes to hospitals destroyed. COVID centers destroyed. Media organizations destroyed. Governmental buildings and edifices destroyed. Many members of Hamas as the organization itself killed. Israel took the opportunity to destroy, apparently, many of the tunnels. Many of these places weren't tunnels. Many of these things were indiscriminate killings or indiscriminate bombings. But assuming for the moment that they were destroying tunnels, the tunnels weren't just things that they were using for, let's say, missiles or materials. It was also things that they were using for food, supplies, and whatnot for a certain black market because of supplies being scarce in the West Bank, where, again, impoverished area. It was costly. So whatever win that might have been there in the context of Hamas, let's just be clear, it was also costly. From the standpoint of Israel, it's not entirely clear what Israel has achieved outside of what I've just noted. But what I just noted, I mean, Israel has a dominant military capacity, so they could always do that. And so it's like, yes, Israel could do that, but is that really a win? And the win part it's sketchy to me, and it feels even weird to even ask that. I'm just asking that because what is the point of having some kind of conflict like this if you're not going to get some kind of advantage out of having the conflict? Otherwise, it's just somewhat of a pointless endeavor. From Netanyahu's case, he needed to stay out of jail, and maybe having something like this kind of wag the dog, is a way of diverting attention away from his own issues, but also have the country look at him as somewhat of a positive light. The thing is, many Israelis want this to continue. Now, from Israelis' standpoint, well, they have bomb shelters. They have sirens to give people a heads up about something that's coming. They have the Iron Dome. The Palestinians have none of those things. So in comparison to who's going to take the most damage, well, I think this might have been 10 Israelis, if it was that many, in comparison to the 200 and something Palestinians. That gives you this disparity in life and death. By the same token, if you're looking at this very cynically, and if you were, let's say, the Native Americans, and you knew that at the end of X number of years, let's say it took decades, but at the end of that time frame, you were in basically reservation, all of your land is gone, and a genocide has been basically committed where you were, for all intents and purposes, wiped off the face of the earth. What is your actions at that point? What do you do? And does functioning silently, is that what you do? Meaning, if you believe earnestly that the people are going to be killed off anyway, do you take certain provocative actions like this in your resistance and in your pushback? And I would be very curious about the take from the Palestinians who are living there. Because if Abbas is really concerned about having an election, meaning he's not going to have an election because he thinks he's going to have a difficult time, and Hamas was able to unify all of these areas of Palestine and all of these people coming together under a strike and everything else, is it possible that they back Hamas on this? And if so, when I'm asking this question about whether or not this is a win, as grim as it sounds for me to ask that question, if the people are still backing Hamas at the end of this process, is that answer a yes? I don't know. But again, from Netanyahu's standpoint and from Israel's standpoint, you've been able to, I suppose, strike a blow to Hamas. You've been able to get this kind of free hand to attack elements that you might have wanted to go after for a while anyway. But at the end of this process, what changes? Is Israel still going to try to steal Sheikh Jarrah? Are they still going to try to take the land in East Jerusalem? And if so, is this going to take place immediately after they try to once again steal the land? And if this is not going to take place immediately after try to steal the land, then is this really a deterrent in the way that this was needed to be a deterrent? I guess my thought is we end up being back in the same spot where it feels like we're Sisyphus pushing something up a hill. And I'm saying we, I know I don't live there, but from the standpoint of being in America and realizing that there's some level of culpability and blame, since my tax dollars go into supporting those bombs and those weapons and those missiles and everything else, I do feel like there's have a take. This goes into a truce. Great. And I understand that everyone wants a ceasefire. Good. But what is a ceasefire in the context of an open-air ghetto? Or for that matter, what is a ceasefire in the case of radical injustice? They're still expropriating the land. The people are still living in horrendous, horrendous conditions. And on top of still living in the horrendous conditions, their ability to function, their ability to live is radically curtailed based upon this prison that Israel is basically running. It's an apartheid state. And yes, you end the truce now, but the apartheid state still persists, meaning this issue still persists because the primary aspect of this is an issue of land, beginning and end. U.S. Secretary Antony Blinken said he spoke with Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi on phone by Thursday during a visit to Greenland, reiterated the message that the United States expects a, quote, de-escalation on the path to a ceasefire, unquote, between Israel and Palestine. I love how we say we expect this. And I don't believe for a moment, I mean, after all, Biden gave out this politics that, oh, Biden is getting serious while simultaneously blocking security resolutions in the UN and given, what, $700,000 or $735,000 in military equipment, guided missiles that will most likely be used to murder Palestinians. On the positive side, a ceasefire. Great. And I suppose details of that ceasefire will be forthcoming. But, again, it's saying 2 a.m. All right, I'll end it here. Quiet in exchange for quiet. Yeah, quiet in exchange for quiet. How weird is this? So the question becomes, what was the point of this? And on some level, the point is resistance. The point is pushing back. The point is showing that they could be, or some having some level of a deterrent. You're even showing off a new arsenal, because the missiles that they were using were different than the missiles that they had typically had at their disposal. I mean, they had the technological capability of hitting pretty much anywhere in Israel at this point, despite Iron Dome still functioning. 10 days. There's one last thing that I want to point out. Things do seem to be shifting on this issue. Israel seems, at this point, to be on the losing side of this argument. If you remember, during Obama's time, they killed over 2,000 Palestinians, 80% of which were civilians. And in this very specific instance, it seemed that a lot of the energy and a lot of the pressure is on Biden to do something to stop it and to not allow it to get to the 2,000 number. I mean, we haven't hit 300, and I'm not necessarily saying I'm going to hit 300. I'm just making the dramatic difference in the number of people that are killed before the pressure started to ratchet up in order to respond. But either way, ceasefire, peace for peace. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.